Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. The moment the cameras captured that subtle but undeniably intimate touch between Lee JunHo and YoonA, the internet froze. But what no one expected was that the real chaos didn't even happen on camera. What truly sent fans into a frenzy happened minutes after that touch, when the pair thought no one was looking, no one was listening, and no one was close enough to capture what unfolded next. Their chemistry had been undeniable for months, but that day, what Lee JunHo did left fans not only screaming, but questioning everything they thought they understood about the two. Today, we're diving into those unbelievable minutes, what happened, how it unfolded, and why fans are absolutely convinced that there's more behind the scenes than either of them have ever admitted. It all began with that single touch, innocent enough to be dismissed by casual viewers, yet undeniably intimate to anyone who has followed Lee JunHo and YoonA's dynamic over the past year. The touch wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. It was small, controlled, almost thoughtful. The kind of gesture two people only share when something exists beneath the surface. Something that doesn't need words, something that doesn't need to be performed. It was a moment so quick you'd miss it if you blinked, but powerful enough to ignite an entire wildfire online. And as everyone was replaying that clip 100 times over, debating what it meant, analyzing the timing, the body language, the micro-expressions, JunHo and YoonA were living through the aftermath in real time. And that aftermath, surprisingly, began with silence. The instant the cameras cut, something shifted between them. The energy didn't fade the way on-screen tension usually does when the director yells, "Cut." Instead, it intensified. YoonA turned her head slightly, giving a tiny laugh, the kind you make when you're trying not to show how flustered you actually are. JunHo looked at her, not at the crew, not at the script, not at the monitors, but directly at her, holding that gaze a fraction of a second longer than he should have. It was subtle, but not subtle enough to escape the attention of a few staff members who later admitted that the atmosphere in the room shifted so noticeably, they felt like they were intruding on something private. The two moved off-set, walking toward a more secluded area where their next scene was being prepared. YoonA tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, clearly trying to compose herself, while JunHo kept his hands tucked into his pockets, the corner of his mouth still holding the trace of a smile. There was something unspoken between them, an invisible thread pulling them closer even as they tried to act normal. One staff member later whispered that what happened next was the real reason fans should be screaming. Because just as they reached the back of the set, where the lighting was dimmer and the noise faded to a low hum, JunHo slowed his steps and waited until YoonA caught up beside him. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he let the silence stretch, not awkwardly, but naturally, like they were in their own little bubble, disconnected from the dozens of people working around them. Then, with a gentle movement that completely contradicts his usually reserved image, he leaned closer and spoke to her in a low voice. Too soft for anyone nearby to hear the words, but clear enough that anyone could see it wasn't about the script. It wasn't about work. It wasn't about the scene. It was personal. And YoonA's reaction, her cheeks warming, her eyes widening for a split second before she smiled, was the confirmation fans needed. But that wasn't the moment that drove the internet wild. That came minutes later. After their short conversation, the staff began adjusting the lighting for the next scene. There was a brief break, just a few minutes, and most people assumed the two would retreat to opposite corners to rehearse lines, check their phones, or take a breather. But instead, the exact opposite happened. YoonA took a step away, and JunHo followed. Not obviously, not dramatically, but with quiet purpose. And fans who have followed him long enough know just how rare that is for him. He's always been careful, controlled, almost overly conscious of how things might appear. But in that moment, he wasn't thinking about the cameras or the public or the reporters lurking just outside the studio. He wasn't thinking about fan speculation or headlines or the dozens of rumors that had followed them since their drama ended. He was thinking only of her. And this is where the shocking moment begins. A stylist approached YoonA with a jacket, adjusting her shoulders and smoothing the fabric, but JunHo gently stepped forward and, without hesitation, pulled the collar of her jacket into place himself. The stylist froze. YoonA froze. And it was such a natural, instinctive motion that it felt as if he had done it countless times before. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to be gentlemanly for the cameras, because there were no cameras pointed at them. It was simply an act of familiarity, something someone only does when they've crossed that invisible line between colleagues and something deeper. Yoon tried to hide her smile, looking away just long enough to regain composure, but it was too late. The staff who witnessed the moment exchanged looks, and although they didn't say anything, the knowing expression on their faces said everything. But JunHo didn't stop there. After adjusting her jacket, he leaned slightly closer and said something, again, too soft to catch. Yet whatever it was made Yoon laugh, genuinely and effortlessly. Not the polite laugh she gives during interviews. Not the playful laugh she uses during variety shows. This was the kind of laugh someone makes when they feel comfortable, when they feel safe, when the person in front of them knows them well enough to say something that hits the exact spot that makes them smile. And then it happened. The moment that sent every fan into absolute hysteria. JunHo reached out and lightly tapped the back of YoonA's hand, a gesture so subtle, yet loaded with meaning. It wasn't a dramatic touch. It wasn't romantic in the usual sense. It wasn't the kind of touch meant to show affection. It was the kind of gesture someone makes when they're trying to comfort you, reassure you, or quietly say, I'm here. And the way YoonA looked at him after that, soft, warm, almost tender, was what changed everything. Because in that tiny fraction of a moment, there was no mistaking it. They weren't acting. They weren't rehearsing. They weren't playing characters. This was real. And fans who later learned about this moment lost their minds. Theories exploded instantly. Some fans were convinced the two were already dating. Others believed they were in the early stages of something new. Some argued that their chemistry was simply too natural to be scripted. And many pointed out that these kinds of gestures, especially from someone as careful as Lee JunHo, don't just happen unless there's something deeply meaningful behind them. But the story doesn't end there. Minutes later, as filming resumed, the two effortlessly slipped back into their roles. But those who were watching closely noticed something different. Their interactions felt warmer. Their eyes lingered longer. Their dialogue carried an unspoken undercurrent that wasn't there before. It was as if something subtle had shifted, like they had reached a quiet understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud.